Chinese and Japanese patrol boats facing off in the choppy waters of the East China Sea is not new. But this week's confrontation around a small, uninhabited island chain has pushed tensions between Asia's two biggest powers into a new, more dangerous phase, one where even the basic facts of what happened are now disputed. At the center of it all are the Senkaku Islands, administered by Japan but claimed by China as the Diaoyu, and also claimed by Taiwan. The rocky outcrops sit between Okinawa and Taiwan, surrounded by rich fishing grounds and potential energy reserves. They are uninhabited, but politically, they are anything but empty. On Tuesday, December 2nd, Japanese and Chinese Coast Guard ships again converged near the disputed islands. Both governments quickly released statements. Both said they were enforcing the law in what they each insist is their own territorial sea, and both described the other side as the aggressor. According to China's Coast Guard, a Japanese fishing boat, accompanied by Japanese patrol vessels, had illegally entered what Beijing calls its territorial waters near the Diaoyu Islands. Chinese ships, they said, moved in and forced the Japanese boat out after issuing warnings and taking what they described as necessary control measures. A spokesperson for the China Coast Guard said, "Our ships took necessary control measures and expelled the Japanese vessel that had intruded into China's territorial waters." Tokyo tells almost the mirror image of that story. Japan's Coast Guard says the fishing vessel was operating legally inside Japanese-administered waters around the Senkaku Islands when two Chinese Coast Guard ships approached and attempted to close in. Japanese patrol vessels, they say, moved between the Chinese ships and the fishing boat and ordered the Chinese vessels to leave. Japanese officials say they lodged a formal diplomatic protest in Beijing, insisting that the Chinese ships violated Japan's territorial waters and demanding they stay away from the area. Chinese officials, in turn, summoned Japan's ambassador and accused Tokyo of infringing China's sovereignty. This is what conflicting reports now looks like in the East China Sea. Two Coast Guards, two sets of video footage and maps, two sharply opposed legal claims, and almost no neutral space left between them. This latest clash isn't happening in isolation. It sits inside a much wider diplomatic crisis between China and Japan that has been building through 2025. The immediate trigger was not actually the islands themselves, but Taiwan. In early November, Japan's new Prime Minister, Sanae Takaichi, made comments suggesting that if China attacked Taiwan in a way that threatened Japan's survival, Tokyo might be forced to respond militarily, likely alongside the United States. Her message was meant as a deterrent, but in Beijing, it landed as a direct challenge. China's defense ministry fired back. A spokesperson warned that Japan would pay a steep price if it became involved in what Beijing calls an internal Chinese matter. According to that spokesperson, Japan will pay a painful price if it steps out of line over Taiwan. From there, the steps escalated quickly. China summoned Japan's ambassador, the first time in about 2 years that Beijing had done so over such remarks. Chinese authorities advised citizens to reconsider travel or study in Japan, a move that could hit Japanese tourism and universities hosting large numbers of Chinese students. China suspended the release of several Japanese films and tightened cultural exchanges, adding an economic and social dimension to the dispute. At sea, China's Coast Guard and Navy began more frequent rights protection patrols around the Senkaku/Diaoyu and announced live fire drills in nearby waters. Chinese state media described a recent operation this way. China Coast Guard vessel 1307 formation conducted patrols within the territorial waters of the Diaoyu Islands. This was a lawful patrol operation conducted by the China Coast Guard to uphold its rights and interests. Japan flatly rejects that framing, insisting the islands are inherent territory of Japan and that any Chinese patrols there amount to unauthorized intrusions. While Japan's language is usually more restrained than China's, officials in Tokyo repeatedly underlined that the Senkaku are covered by the US-Japan Security Treaty, meaning that in a crisis, Washington could be drawn in as well. On a map, the Senkaku-Diaoyu chain is a scattering of rocks and islets, 8 small features in all, sometimes described as 5 islands and 3 rocks. They have no permanent population, no big port, and no obvious strategic base. So why are they so important? First, Control of the islands brings control of surrounding waters, which are rich in fish and potentially in oil and gas. Second, they sit along vital sea routes and near key Japanese islands like Okinawa and closer still to Taiwan. Anyone who dominates that arc of territory gains leverage over shipping lanes and military movements in the broader Western Pacific. Third, and maybe most crucially, they have become symbols. For Japan, continuing to administer the Senkaku is proof it will not be bullied or salami sliced out of its territory. For China, challenging that control is presented as undoing past injustices and pushing back against what Beijing portrays as a lingering post-war order it never fully accepted. This symbolic weight explains why disputes over fishing boats and Coast Guard ships can so quickly turn into diplomatic crises, and why each side is extremely reluctant to back down, even over a minor tactical incident. The pattern we're seeing this week fits what analysts often call China's grey zone tactics, actions that fall below the threshold of open conflict but are designed to steadily shift the status quo. Rather than sending warships and firing shots, China uses Coast Guard vessels and civilian fishing fleets to press its claims. These ships sail into waters Japan administers, linger there, and sometimes try to approach Japanese boats. Each time, Japan's Coast Guard has to respond, often with more vessels, more hours at sea, more risk of close encounters. Researchers tracking these patterns say that Chinese vessels now enter the waters around the islands on a near-monthly, sometimes near-weekly basis, often staying inside the contiguous zone or even what Japan considers its territorial sea. One recent analysis put it bluntly, noting that Chinese ships seem to conduct what looks like ceremonial intrusions into Japan-controlled waters, timed to send political messages or answer developments in Tokyo or Washington. On the Japanese side, the response has been to beef up Coast Guard capacity, boost budgets, and harden rules of engagement, while still trying to avoid anything that could be seen as militarizing the islands. But the line between law enforcement and military posture is getting thinner. This year's crisis over the islands cannot be separated from the broader question of Taiwan. Japan has grown increasingly vocal about the possibility that a conflict in the Taiwan Strait would quickly drag in Japan, given its geography, alliance obligations with the US, and the presence of Japanese islands like Yonaguni just over 100 kilometers from Taiwan's coast. Japan's government has been deploying new missile units and radar systems to its southwestern island chain, including Yonaguni. China sees those moves as aimed squarely at it. Chinese military planners worry that in any Taiwan conflict, those islands could serve as launch pads for Japanese and US operations. So when Prime Minister Takaichi suggested Japan might respond militarily to a hypothetical Chinese attack on Taiwan, Chinese officials pounced on the remark. A senior Chinese official warned that Tokyo was playing with fire, and the Defense Ministry underlined that the Chinese armed forces are fully capable of crushing any external intervention. In parallel, Taiwan has reported surges in Chinese military activity around its air and sea approaches, sometimes overlapping with Japan's own monitoring zones around the Senkaku area. Taiwanese authorities said they recently detected dozens of Chinese aircraft and several naval vessels operating near both Taiwan and Japan's Yonaguni Island as part of what they described as joint combat patrols by Beijing. That overlapping geography means any miscalculation near the Senkaku/Diaoyu could quickly spiral beyond a purely bilateral China-Japan issue, drawing in Taiwan and the United States. The latest standoff also highlights how China and Japan are now fighting an information battle around these incidents. Each side releases photographs, short video clips, and carefully worded statements aimed not just at their domestic audience, but at the wider international community. In this week's case, Chinese media and official accounts emphasized that the Japanese fishing boat had intruded into Chinese waters and that Chinese ships had behaved calmly and professionally while carrying out lawful enforcement actions. The China Coast Guard spokesman Liu Dejun stressed that our patrols around Diaoyu Island are a normal exercise of China's sovereignty and no one should misinterpret them. Japanese coverage focused on the risk to its fishermen and highlighted a narrative of China as the one repeatedly testing boundaries. Japan's Coast Guard said Chinese ships had tried to approach the Japanese fishing vessel and that Japanese patrol boats had moved in to shield it, reinforcing the image of Japan as defending ordinary citizens going about their work. Both foreign ministries then weighed in. Officials in Tokyo described China's actions as absolutely unacceptable, while counterparts in Beijing accused Japan of hyping up the situation and distorting what had really occurred. The result is a familiar but dangerous pattern. Once each government has publicly locked in its version of events, backing down becomes even harder. Domestic audiences hear their own side's story first and most often leaving little political room for compromise. Lurking behind every incident near the Senkaku Diaoyu is the question of how far the United States would go if a clash turned deadly. For years, US administrations have stated that the islands fall under Article 5 of the US-Japan Security Treaty, which obliges Washington to assist Japan if territories under its administration are attacked. That does not mean the US wants a fight in the East China Sea. In fact, it would likely do almost anything to avoid one. But it does mean that a fatal collision, a misfired shot, or a ramming incident gone wrong could raise urgent alliance questions. Analysts warn that with more ships and aircraft operating in increasingly tight spaces, the odds of an accident are rising. A recent study on the islands noted that while there had been surprising stability for several years, the latest crisis shows how quickly that stability can erode when broader political tensions spike. For now, neither Beijing nor Tokyo appears to want war, but both are signalling they are prepared to run higher risks at sea to protect what they see as core interests: sovereignty for China, territorial integrity, and alliance credibility for Japan. From China's perspective, the goals seem clear. Establish over time a sense that Chinese Coast Guard patrols around the Diaoyu Islands are normal and uncontested. Undermine Japan's administrative control by making it appear fragile or disputed. Send a message to Tokyo and to Washington that China will not be deterred from pressing its maritime claims, especially as it faces what it sees as a tightening network of US alliances. Japan's objectives, in turn, are almost the mirror image. Demonstrate that its control over the Senkaku Islands remains intact and that Chinese ships cannot operate there without being challenged. Avoid any move that could be seen as militarizing the dispute while still signaling strength and resolve. Keep the United States firmly engaged, both as a deterrent to China and as reassurance to the Japanese public. Diplomatically, both countries still say they want dialogue. There have been discussions about possible meetings on the margins of international gatherings, and Japanese diplomats have traveled to Beijing in recent weeks to try to lower the temperature. But so far, those efforts have not produced any visible breakthrough. Given the highly charged atmosphere, fueled by Taiwan, by military modernization on both sides, and by a broader global mood of rivalry, even a small step forward would matter. That could be something as modest as a new hotline between coast guards, shared protocols for warning shots or maneuvers, or a quietly agreed limit on how long ships can stay close to each other near the islands. For now, though, the evidence points in the opposite direction. More patrols, more military exercises, harsher rhetoric, and, as we saw this week, completely opposing accounts of what happens when Chinese and Japanese vessels meet in those contested waters. What's clear is that the rocks known as Senkaku in Japan and Diaoyu in China are once again a flashpoint, not just for two countries, but for a region where great power rivalry, alliance politics, and historical grievances all now collide in a very small, very risky patch of sea.